Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are excited to have you all here. We're going to give folks just a minute or two to go ahead and come into the Zoom, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all for being here, and we'll get started in just a minute. Hi, folks. Welcome. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. We're just letting folks come into the Zoom, and we will get started shortly. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, it's 12:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome to our event, a panel discussion about the tech layoffs, which have been in the news quite a bit. So thank you for being here. My name is Samantha Gordon. I am the Chief Program Officer here at TechEquity. I'm really excited to be here with you all. Really honored to be joined by a really fantastic panel today. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to you all shortly. Before we jump in and get started, I just want to make sure that anyone new joining us gets an opportunity to know who we are and what we do at TechEquity. So at TechEquity, we engage tech workers in the tech community to take action on building an economy where everyone benefits from the growth that tech has created. So we do that really in three main ways, which you can see on this slide here. One is we do education with events like this, as well as blogs and content to try and make sure that folks know what's happening. Second is we do public policy. So we work in partnership with lots of partner organizations and community groups to develop a set of public policy to advance our mission, essentially. And third is when we put out research or new initiatives, we try to pair that with voluntary corporate practice changes that companies could make if they want to do the right thing and make those improvements overnight for their employees or the communities in which they work and live. And the two main areas we focus on are housing and labor, how they relate inside the economy and inside the tech industry. So just thank you all for being here today. We love being able to provide these events. There are lots of ways to get active with TechEquity. If you're interested, our community manager, Herman Calderon, is in the chat, and we'll drop a link. You can, if you have time, we have different ways you can take action, either with us or with partner organizations. If you don't have time, but you have money, you can contribute financially as well. So we just appreciate everyone's support and being here. A couple quick housekeeping things. One is our chat is open and we use a code of conduct. We'll post a link to it, but essentially says like we want to create safe spaces for learning. So please be respectful of the other people in the chat, other attendees and their opinions. And I think folks are familiar now, we're headed into the senior year of the pandemic. So, on Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, because if you put questions in the chat, we may lose track of them. And we will have time for Q&A with our panel at the end. We also record our webinars, so you should have got a notice about that, and that will be shared out via email, and it'll also live on our website if you want to come back to this. And finally, I want to welcome our interpreter, Julie Carlson, who will provide ASL interpretation. If you are in need of that interpretation, you can select, there's a new feature in Zoom, you can select that at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so tech layoffs. This is a panel discussion, and so, like I said, the layoffs have gotten a lot of media attention, but we really wanted to use our space at TechEquity to lift up some of the workers and the stories that aren't always centered in the main media narrative. So I'm really, really honored, and I feel very fortunate that we're joined by a really special panel today. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves to you and sort of how they come into this discussion. So I'm going to start with Melissa. If you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Melissa Engel. My pronouns are she and her. I'm wearing a black dress. I'm sitting in a room with a a white wall. It has a cherry blossom print on the back. And I'm a former senior data scientist at Twitter, where I worked as a contract employee.
Great. Thank you so much. And Dr. Hira, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. My name's Hira. I'm a professor of political science at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and I've been studying tech labor markets for about 20 years or so now.
Wonderful. And Maria Noel, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Maria Noel Fernandez, and I'm with Silicon Valley Rising and Working Partnerships. And we are a campaign coalition that came together about 8 years ago with this idea that we wanted to inspire the tech industry to do better with and on behalf of the service workers that make the tech industry in large part what it is locally. And have been doing that work alongside some of you all and some incredible leaders on the ground that have been organizing for many, many years, and that got to wins like the Google Community Benefits Agreement not too long ago. And now 10,000 service workers are organized within the tech industry. It's great to be with you all, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of you for joining. I think each of you represent such an important constituency in these conversations. And so really just wanted to jump in and hear from your perspective what you're seeing in this sort of, maybe unprecedented, at least not in the last 20 years moment in the tech industry. And Maria Noel, I was hoping we could start with you. I think a lot of people became aware of sort of the scale of layoffs in tech when Twitter and Meta had layoffs, pretty sizable layoffs within the same period of time. But these layoffs have been happening for a while. And I immediately thought of you all and the workers that you work with because Meta had done a layoff of those service workers earlier this fall. And it was done a bit differently than what we saw in the news with the direct hires more recently. So I wondered if you could just talk about what happened with service workers a few months ago and what the experience has been like for service workers at Meta, as well as, if it's applicable other tech campuses as layoffs have begun to sort of take shape around the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'll start with is that, service workers within the tech industry have been waiting, just like so many of us, right? But really waiting. We, for the most part, saw the tech industry stand by the service workers during the pandemic. And we've been waiting to see what was going to happen in this new phase of how we all work and hybrid and what we're seeing in different companies. And unfortunately, a few months ago, what we saw was in many ways moving back about 8 years ago, before Silicon Valley Rising was born, when things were just told to the service employees, look, you're out of a job. That's just the way it is, versus it actually being a conversation and being in relationship with each other. And so what we saw was 150 janitors were told that on Friday, they were not going to have a job anymore. The difference this time, though, I would say, is that workers are organized. And so SEIU, USWW, and those workers really pushed back and said, absolutely not. Like, this is not actually how we can be treated, and we can't have service workers be the first ones on the chopping block. And so after a short but strong fight, most of those service workers were reinstated. However, I think the thing I want to lift up here is that, look, things are changing, and what we are really wanting to make very clear is that having a voice on the job means that you're part of the solution. That means that, look, there might be changes. There might be things that have to be shifted around, but service workers, what they need is to be at the table so that they can be in dialogue around what it means for them to actually now have to cover more square footage, but with less people in it. What it means to have baristas that maybe don't have the same level of, of employees that are coming every day, and how do they share work? And those types of conversations are the conversations that service workers want to be a part of, versus just being told you're out of a job. And that's what we're really working towards in this moment, is being a part of the solution.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. I think it is such a critical difference. And I think it's a good segue to Melissa. I think this is a good moment to turn to you. Like Maria Noel said, the service workers at Meta were organized. They were able to apply pressure and come to solutions, be at the table. And I think probably as a result of that experience, we saw a different pathway for direct hired workers, right? When those layoffs happened, it was rolled out differently. And I think it's been held up in some respects in the media as an example, as compared to Twitter. And obviously you were a contract worker with Twitter, and that's been nonstop in the news. And I think it was Casey Newton who first reported that approximately 4,400 of the 5,500 contract workers at Twitter had been laid off in the middle of the night on a Saturday. And so I wondered if you could just share, more about your experience at Twitter and what your experience of the layoffs was and what that's meant for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a senior data scientist at Twitter, and I worked on these machine learning algorithms, and specifically in content moderation, and more specifically in political misinformation. So we were searching Twitter to try to catch political misinfo before it got out there. So as far as the layoffs happened, the full-time employees were given an email that said, your status at the company, you're going to get an email tomorrow at 9 a.m. It's going to tell you if you're still at the company, you'll have your new assignment. If you're not, it'll have your severance package information. I didn't get that email. I looked around, the contractors who were working did not get that email. Everybody in my department formed a WhatsApp group. What we were finding was that at 11 p.m. local, employees were just being logged out of their system. So New York employees on the East Coast were logged out. Then we saw it happen on Chicago. They were logged out. Some while they were pushing code to production were logged out. And so this is a giant tidal wave kind of coming across the United States. I'm in San Francisco, and you're wondering, is this going to hit me, or am I going to be on, sort of high enough ground, metaphorically speaking? The next morning, my boss was let go in that round. The next morning, I didn't have an email that said, here's your new assignment, but I still had access to all the systems. So I lived in this uncertain situation. And keep in mind, I worked in political misinformation, and this was the week of the US midterms. It was incredibly disorganized, incredibly chaotic. I had no idea to whom I was to report. At one point, a ticket was filed in my name, sent to Elon Musk. I took a screenshot of it. It was so surreal. What's this person's employment status? And so for an entire week, we lived in this space where we didn't know. And Casey, that's correct. So Saturday, I was November 12th, I was at the mall with my daughter and her friend. And I got a pop-up on my phone that said, one or more of your access tokens has been removed. I tried to open my email, my Twitter email, I tried to open Slack. No such user exists. That's how I was told that I was fired. Nobody explained anything to me, no email, nothing. I was just cut off.
Yeah, and I think folks that have been following our work or Silicon Valley Rising's work, or any of you all know that, sort of the dynamics of contract work is that the parent, or the lead company, the Twitter in this case, often assumes no liability for what happens to the contractors. And so we see things like this happen where overnight, folks lose their job, or maybe even, I know there's a class action that's being pursued at Twitter for the contractors, because some are saying they didn't even receive pay for work they had already completed, which is illegal, no matter if you're a contract worker or a direct worker. So we have been studying these issues. And I think one of the things that folks that follow our work know, and Melissa, you would know very well, is that a lot of tech uses contractors for content moderation and for managing misinformation and disinformation. And so it was concerning to see a massive layoff of such a critical workforce right before the US election. And that's something that, I think folks have been sort of on guard about in tech because of how work is structured around content moderation. So yeah, it sounds like that was a surprise experience for folks, and one that was very concerning to see happen.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I just want to add that the full-time employees who were laid off, they received approximately a 3-month severance package. And as you alluded to, the contractors didn't get anything. We're often treated as a kind of disposable workforce, a flexible workforce, if you will. But in this case, flexible just means I don't have to pay you benefits. You don't have any health care. You don't have any protections. We're not covered under the WARN Act because my employer is a much smaller employer. So I don't have those kinds of protections.
Absolutely. Well, this is probably a good moment to move to you, Ron. You know, another group that's had a lot of crossover, obviously, with service workers and contractors, in addition to direct employees, is our immigrant workforce in tech. So this has been a question in a lot of the reporting that we've seen and news stories about the layoffs is what happens to workers who are here on visas that are sponsored by their employer. So I wonder if you could give some context for sort of the typical parameters for workers who are here as an immigrant. You know, folks are somewhat familiar with H-1B visas, but, you know, visas sponsored by their employers and what these layoffs mean for workers in those positions.
Yeah, so the news coverage has been quite interesting. Of course, a layoff for anybody is devastating, oftentimes economically, but also to the family and socially, and it really can have significant psychological effects. And I don't think we should, lose sight of that. Now, it's particularly bad for groups of non-immigrant workers. So they're guest workers. They're sometimes called guest workers because they're guests in the country because of their work. If you have no work, then you're not a guest anymore. You don't have residency rights or status. And the news coverage, it's been interesting because it's all of a sudden these large news organizations have discovered that these folks have not just precarity, but residency precarity, that all of a sudden that their ability to stay legal status in the country is dependent on being employed by that particular employer. And so the way, at least for H-1B workers, it works is they have 60 days to try to transfer their H-1B visa to another employer. That's not as easy as it might sound. And I think a lot of the news coverage hasn't picked up on that, the transference. But I think it also misses sort of the larger issue, which is, there have been a lot of layoffs, thousands of layoffs, probably of H-1Bs, some reports of 45,000 layoffs overall. And, if you do the numbers, probably 7,000 to 8,000 of those folks are on H-1Bs or L1 visas. But the bigger issue is that there's about 600,000 H-1B workers, probably another 250,000 L1 visa workers in high-skilled jobs. They all face the same thing every day. If they get laid off, they will lose their legal status. So what that does is it puts a huge amount of power in the hands of the employer. And so those folks are living that every day. That's bad for those workers because they're living under different circumstances. It's also bad for the labor market in general. And we're going to see this play out as those workers, particularly the ones who've been laid off, are desperate to go find something as quickly as possible. And they're willing to trade off, rationally, wages and working conditions. And you're going to see, kind of the underbelly of contracting type of employers who are going to take advantage of this as a kind of almost as a feeding frenzy. And that has not just bad effects for those folks, and it does have bad effects, and we should care about that, but it has bad effects for the whole labor market. And so that's going to have knock-on effects to lots and lots of other people who are in that same sector, especially as we've had these concentrated layoffs. So I think what we want to be thinking about are the employment rights and how we, how the system is rigged really to undercut labor, and in some cases really pitting immigrant workers against US workers. And that's a real problem in terms of the conversation in Washington, where I live and have a lot of discussions. And we need to find some kind of way of building more solidarity amongst folks so that we can recognize that the problem really is around rights, employment rights, and the way the rules and laws are set up, that these guest workers have substandard rights, and therefore they're going to be exploited, whether they get laid off or if they get employed or get reemployed.
Absolutely. And I guess my next question is probably for all three of you. You might all have different answers to this, but you're all lifting up sort of the experience of important constituencies in this. And something that I know a lot of my friends and family were asking me about when the layoffs started to happen was, well, aren't tech workers paid pretty well, right? So they have a cushion, and, a lot of them are getting severance. And so obviously that's not necessarily the case for workers who are on contract or service workers, or even sometimes highly skilled immigrant workers, for all the reasons, Ron, you just laid out. But, given that, workers in these roles and situations are often in more precarious positions, I wonder if any of you feel like there is a layoff plan or a strategy that could be used that would be considered more equitable, more fair. What would that look like? What would it look like to be able to ensure that workers that you either are or represent would be treated fairly as possible, given the context?
I think a lot, you're right, there's this stereotype of like the tech bro, right? This person who's like 24 and they're unattached, they don't have any children, they're earning $250K a year, and they're driving up wages and housing costs. And of course, those are real issues. But, I'm 48 years old. I am a single parent. I have 2 children. I live in San Francisco. Most of my working career, I've had to work 2 jobs. I currently teach on nights and weekends to support myself. And it's very, very difficult to support yourself in this environment. And there's a lot of people who are in that situation. So I think, one way forward, like what kind of protections can we enact, is simple, like a legislative fixes, right? So full-time employees have this WARN Act, which protects them. You can't lay off companies if you have over 500 employees. You can't lay them off without giving them 60 days notice. Contractors don't have those protections. So either extend the WARN Act to contract employees, or maybe a separate piece of legislation or something like that. And I think that's definitely one fix that I can think of.
Great. And I know, Maria, Noel, you talked about this when you were talking about the experience of service workers, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add about the importance of being organized and having a voice and a seat at the table.
Yeah, I feel like everything goes back to that for me, and for the workers that I'm in relationship with, is bringing people together, having folks lift up their voice together, and being able to do that through their union. And so that is what honestly protected those Facebook janitors. And that's, in these situations, what has really supported these workers. The other thing I just wanted to lift up here, and especially as I listened to Melissa speak, I think this moment is also another reminder for all workers, contract workers, service workers, that we are workers.
Yep.
And that how powerful could it be if we really could build stronger solidarity among all of us? And what would it look like to actually, try to break down some of the silos between a direct tech service worker and a contract service worker and a service worker within the tech industry? Because ultimately, again, these layoffs are just another example of we are workers. And I think there's an opportunity there to really build something together.
Absolutely. That was my thought throughout this. I just kept having this thought of, no matter how much money you make, no matter what your background is, at the end of the day, you are a worker and anything can happen to you. And I think, for a lot of workers inside tech, in particular, directly employed workers who maybe haven't worked outside of tech, there's not a fluency in sort of what can happen if you are organized. And, I know I was a labor organizer for, over a decade. And a lot of times, just so folks know, in our contract are layoff provisions. So employers can't lay you off without first negotiating on the terms, on who receives the layoff, how those decisions are made, when people get notice, what the severance will be. So for large scale employers, this is a huge deal, right? Because you can actually sit down and say, how do we do this in a way that's objective, that's fair, that workers have a voice in, that they're part of the solution? Can we see the books and make sure that you're not inflating this or just changing the business model? So just wanted to add that, for folks that aren't familiar, those are all things that are possible and that some workers, not many, but some workers in America have. And Ron, I don't know if there's anything you want to add from, the immigrant perspective that would make this more equitable. Certainly companies fight hard to prove that these workers are extremely necessary and no one in the US can fill that role, but they don't fight as hard when there are layoffs, right? About what sort of should happen to them. So I'm curious what your take on, better practices would be for immigrant workers.
Yeah, so that's actually a bit of a myth. They don't actually have to demonstrate that there's a need for these workers. And so that's a big problem. And we have a system that is tilted towards guest workers rather than permanent immigration. And so from a kind of a higher level view, what we really should be doing, if we need immigrant workers, we should bring them in as immigrants, not as guest workers who have far fewer employment rights. So, I mean, that should be, from a bigger picture point of view, what you should be pushing for, because on an H-1B visa, an employer can actually displace US workers, and this goes on all the time. And this is one of the reasons why US workers, and it's been kind of a divide and conquer, are very skeptical of the H-1B program, is because there have been cases where they've actually had to train their H-1B replacement. Now, a lot of that goes through outsourcing firms because it's a way of getting around some of the rules. But the bigger picture is let's have folks come in, like my parents came in as immigrants from India, but come in with green cards, with residency status, with full rights, employment rights, so that we don't have to write complicated employment regulations and rules and laws and policies around guest worker programs. Because whether it's the UAE, Qatar, the US, every guest worker program is very vulnerable to being exploited. And the only way to kind of control those things is to put in lots of rules and regulations. And we know employers are able to play games with that. And so you should be favoring immigration over guest worker programs.
That's really helpful to know. Thank you for sharing that. I think I'm curious, we were sort of touching on this, Maria Noel, with your statements on, a worker is a worker. But, I think many of the CEOs that we've seen talk about the layoffs, talked about them as the result of unmet growth plans from, the unprecedented economic boom for tech companies during the pandemic. And I think if we could take, sort of off the discussion, off the table, the bigger question of whether or not constantly growing and providing shareholder value is an indicator of a successful company and why they have to do that. Let's just say we take that off the table, except that this is happening. I'd love to think about, what workers, whether they're service workers, contract workers on a, guest worker visa, immigrants, what they should take from this experience thus far. What advice would you have for them? Potentially, Melissa, I'm thinking about you in particular for contractors at other companies. What advice would you have for them at this moment, having gone through what you've gone through?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like historically, there's been a lot of resistance to unionization, to collective power, to collective bargaining. But listen, there's not a lot of people. We're the people bringing the value to the company. There's not a lot of people who can do what I can do. I'm a machine learning engineer, and I'm no more valuable, as Maria says, than the people who are doing the service work. There's historical reasons. There's some classism involved, and there's this idea of, sort of do-it-yourselfism, this libertarian streak that runs through. But I, for a brief while, contracted with the city, and I was helping them set up some data infrastructure. And of course, the city here in San Francisco, those tech workers are also unionized. And once they've been there for a year, they have all those union protections and they feel much more secure in their own workplace. But people who are workers, even highly skilled workers, so-called, are resistant to or unaware of that other tech workers have and do unionize.
Absolutely. And I don't know, Maria Noel or Ron, if you would have anything to add to that as, advice for workers who may be watching what's happening and wondering what's next.
I mean, I just couldn't agree more with Melissa. I mean, I actually think we could be, you know, what we're seeing across the country is that favorability towards labor unions as at an all-time high. And so I think it is an opportunity in this moment for workers within the tech industry to look inward and say, well, what does that mean for us? What does it mean that Starbucks worker, Amazon workers, service workers within tech industry, that folks are coming together and building power and changing the conditions of their work and their lives. And when things happen, they're able to push back. What would it look like? What would it look like if more workers within the tech industry were able to do that? So I think it's a moment of both reflection and potential action.
Absolutely. And I, if any of you know, correct me in the chat if I get this wrong, but I also just want to lift up that the digital workers at the New York Times are actually on a digital strike today, and are asking folks not to use any of the digital platforms from the New York Times in solidarity with them. And I think that's been something that's really stood out to me, is a lot of the tech workers inside other institutions that aren't traditionally considered tech companies have been unionizing, have been organizing, have been sort of understanding their power and their necessity in these moments. So just wanted to also mention that since we're meeting on that day.
So I just add that, you know, of course, this is a long-term problem, a long-standing problem where union density in, you know, computer occupations is very low. There's a lot of factors. Melissa talked about a lot of those important ones. Some of it is just awareness. But there's also a lot of policy issues around this. And you know, Silicon Valley, the tech industry has been able to get away with a lot of things that no other industry, from a workplace, from discrimination, you know, I mean, rampant age discrimination that goes on, you know, these games that they play with the contractors, misclassifying workers. And Washington DC looks the other way on a lot of this because of the clout. And this is because there's not enough worker voice, whether it's through unions or through other means of workers being represented. And some of that is also the media's fault for not picking up on this, right? Being kind of snowed by Silicon Valley and the slick kinds of things that they go through. This impression that every tech worker has, you know, is making lots and lots of money and will easily find another job, and they have huge amount of agency on their own, that they don't need collective agency. It's just false, and it's been false for many, many years.
Absolutely. Well, and you all have touched on this a bit, but I did want to just talk about, you know, what better worker protections might look like from a regulatory or, you know, legislative landscape. So Melissa, you mentioned the WARN Act, and just to restate for folks that aren't familiar, the WARN Act is a California law, and it's also a federal law. They're pretty similar, although the California protections are a little bit higher. But essentially, for any large employer that's planning a mass layoff, so more than 500 workers, they're required to give 60 days notice for a variety of reasons, least of which is so that the unemployment agency can be prepared for a flood of workers coming to request unemployment. And the law doesn't apply to contracted workers, whether that's service workers or, you know, office workers, because they're considered employed by a different entity. So unless their staffing agency or their vendor is a large employer that is laying off 500 people, they're not covered under those provisions. So that's something I know we've been looking at, we've been thinking about what would it look like to change that. And I wonder if you all see a role for elected officials or regulators to play in helping to ensure better protections for workers in these positions who are impacted really severely, but often don't have the same level of protection that many directly employed workers have. I don't know if you all have thoughts or ideas about what that might look like.
So I want to just piggyback on what Ron was saying. There is a lot of clout from these tech companies. For instance, in California, in a recent election, this Prop 22 was proposed, and it was going to give DoorDash workers and Uber drivers, reclassify them from independent contractors to employees, to give them some protections. And that was defeated after an intense marketing campaign by these companies. And I'm just going to say, I used to work for DoorDash as a delivery driver, and they participated in straight up wage theft. We were promised a certain amount of money per delivery, $5 per delivery. We were also told you're going to get 100% of tips, but they only paid us $1 per delivery. So if the customer tipped us $4, all of that tip went to meet that minimum. And these are the kinds of games that these companies play with their independent contractors that they couldn't necessarily play with employees. So I think like a reclassification is one way to give these workers more protections.
Absolutely. I know Maria Noel knows that world really well and plays a big role in gig worker organizing.
Absolutely. And, I think the other thing that I unfortunately have to remind folks is that there is still a lot of retaliation and intimidation that happens when workers are organizing, even within the tech industry. I mean, I think for the most part, we have this idea, not everyone, but there's a lot of folks that think, that happens somewhere else, like that type of intimidation, retaliation, that can't be happening in Silicon Valley when workers are trying to organize. And the reality is it does happen. And yes, there are some protections on the books, but it is an area where I think we're really needing more leadership from our elected officials and allies to really make sure that workers are protected when they're using their voice and they're trying to organize.
And I just add, piggybacking on that, one element is enforcement. Protection's not very useful unless you actually fund the enforcement agencies. And the Wage and Hour Division is chronically underfunded. And just on the H-1B side, the whole system is rigged so that it's not enforced. It's a complaint-driven system where an H-1B worker who has got precarious residency status is supposed to complain to the Wage and Hour Division, figure out how to do that complaint, and then hope that they're going to be protected, and then it might get adjudicated over 4 or 5 years if they pick it up. So, I mean, the whole system is kind of crazy that way, and we should be enforcing the protections that we've got in the books. We've got to have stronger ones, but a first step is let's get the appropriations to those folks.
Absolutely. I know that there's been a lot of reporting coming out, on just what's happened to workers during the pandemic with a lot of these sort of enforcements. And I know, Maria Noel, correct me if I get this wrong, but I can't remember if it was you all or another organization that put out a report that for gig workers, for drivers, there have been over 50 homicides while on the job, and just incredible health and safety violations. So the more vulnerable workers get, as Melissa was stating, the way they can play with independent contractors versus employees, the more vulnerable workers get, the more dangerous things get, right? Like that is the most extreme, but we see gradations of that across these sort of fissures of work. And I know because we look a lot at temp staffing and contract work. I believe that it was the Labor Department in California. There was just a report put out on the number of complaints and violations on various labor law enforcement. Temp work was number 4, I think, on the list in terms of highest rates of offenses in the state in terms of labor law violations. So we know that the more precarious the work gets, the more dangerous it is for workers. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that before I move to the next question. I didn't mean to keep talking. So before we move to Q&A, I did want to also just provide a space. Our community is full of tech workers and just people who care really deeply about these issues, whether they're, we meet them all the time. They're working inside many of these companies, trying to be agents of change, or they're in the community trying to be in solidarity with folks that are experiencing various inequities as a result of these systems. And so I wonder if any of you have calls to action or things that you would ask, folks that are watching along that they should pay attention to, read about, think about how they could use their voice inside a tech company or as a community member, just anything you might want them to be aware of and thinking about and how they can be helpful on these issues.
Well, I'll jump in there. I mean, I cannot undersell the importance of tech workers who have been side by side with service workers in negotiations. It's solidarity, and it's more than that. I mean, having tech workers stand in those negotiations and use their power and position to say that they want a different type of interaction between the company and these workers was a game changer. And so I think number one is, if that is happening, if you know that workers are organizing within the service sector at your company, to really step in and offer your solidarity and support. So, and how important that is. I think too, particularly on layoffs, there are actions that are happening, unfortunately, very often in this moment. And so again, actually having tech service workers come out and join actions and again, stand with service workers is very powerful. And actually having tech workers raise questions within the company of like, hey, we heard 150 janitors are being laid off, or X type of worker, or bus drivers. What's the situation there? And actually having several folks raise those questions within companies has been incredibly helpful in the past. And so not feeling like it's not your place, or you don't know all the details, or not sure how, like actually saying, no, I want to stand in solidarity and want to know what my company is doing to these service workers, and asking questions. That goes up the food chain, and that creates space for us to do our work with service workers.
Great. I don't know, Ron or Melissa, if you have anything you'd want folks to
Yeah,
know.
so not to get too sort of academic wonky here, but Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America back, long ago in the 19th century. And one of the main things that you take from that book was that Americans join volunteer organizations. They join organizations. And then Bob Putnam, a well-known political scientist, wrote a book maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago now, called Bowling Alone, where what he said was part of the breakdown of our social capital in our country is the fact that we're not bowling with we're not in bowling leagues. We don't have time. Things have become much more atomized. We're not parts of groups. And I see this in the professional side, where young people especially, are not joining tech workers, are not joining the professional associations. And so they don't have that channel for directing their voice, for directing, what they're feeling. Like Maria has had good experiences, but I'm sure there's lots of other tech workers who feel like I have these feelings, but I just don't know how to express them. And so we have to find ways to be able to tap that and tap those kinds of energies and show them that there are these organizations. Back in the early 2000s, there were attempts to create such organizations, but they never really took off. I think to make it a little bit more positive and optimistic, the message I would give them, and I've spent lots of time in Washington, D.C., is if you're organized, you can really have a voice and you can have a real impact, whether it's in Washington or Sacramento. But you've got to be organized. You've got to be persistent. It can't be one-off. And so that's where you have to build those types of organizations and institutions to be able to sit there year after year, week after week, working, and waiting for that window of opportunity to get things through.
Absolutely. And we will send follow-up information, including information about Maria Noel's organization, which I think would love to have everyone's watching support. We would love for you to join TechEquity. You can get active with us. You can make a financial contribution. And like we were talking about, we also, if you're a contract worker that wants to share your experience, contract worker in tech, we're going to be talking to people, interviewing them about these experiences and figuring out, like Melissa mentioned, if there are legislative fixes that we can take on to help make sure this doesn't continue to happen in a way that's inequitable for contract workers. So we'd love to hear from you. Herman, our community manager, I'm sure is dropping his info in the chat. We'd love to talk to you all about that. And I'm going to welcome our Director of Content, Marian Wellington, who I believe has questions for our panel.
I sure do. First of all, thank you all so much for this conversation. It's been, I know a lot of people have been feeling kind of aimless and confused about all of this. So having you all share your expertise is really clarifying. So thank you. We have a lot of great questions. So I'll start at the top. I think this one will probably go to Sam and Maria Noel. I'm curious how you see all the layoffs affecting the diverse demographics of the companies that the companies already have issues with. Do you think that this will set DE&I efforts in the industry back?
I don't know if Maria Noel or Melissa wants to go. I can also add from our perspective too.
I mean, from our perspective, Silicon Valley Rising actually came together because we were seeing that all of the DEI conversations were not including the vast majority of people of color that are on the campuses every day, which are service workers. And, you know, they're there every day and have been. And so, yes, I guess the short answer is yes, because as we're seeing layoffs and we're seeing service workers on the chopping block, you know, and we have to realize that for the most part, it's women of color. And so, that's the conversation that we've really been trying to lift up, is that, again, if these companies want to live the values that they've been talking about over the last several years, particularly, then they've got to engage even on layoffs in a different way when we're talking about particularly layoffs that are predominantly affecting women of color in the region.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, tech has a sort of historical bias patterns. You know, there's very at these high-tech jobs, there's relatively fewer Hispanic people, relatively fewer Black people at these quote unquote high-skilled jobs. And there's lots of reasons for that. But an interesting knock-on effect, I work on these machine learning algorithms. What we've discovered over time, and probably everybody is aware of these, is that the programmers encode their own biases into these machine learning algorithms. Just as we tend to hire the best candidate tends to look like us, machine learning engineers and data scientists, we encode our biases unconsciously into these algorithms. So it's extra important that these tools don't exclude workers of color and women and diverse perspectives. And we can absolutely see as these layoffs have come about, 4,400 contractors were laid off of 5,500. That's this shadow workforce at Twitter, which used the number 7,500. You know, that's been decimated. And many of these contractors were people of color working in India, working in just across in Brazil, you know, across the globe. And they've been disproportionately affected, and we no longer have those voices.
Well, and I would just add, from TechEquity's work on our contract worker disparity project, we did a first person narrative project interviewing contract workers in tech, and then we also ran one of the larger surveys of sort of office-based contract workers in the tech industry. And our research found that disproportionately those workers were Black, Brown, Indigenous, and non-binary and women as compared to the directly employed workforce. So you have a pool that's already disproportionately more diverse than the directly employed workers, and all of the sort of, as we've been talking about, knock-on effects that come with that: lower pay, more precarious positions, fewer benefits. And then when those folks leave, then what are you left with? And on top of it, we've also seen there are statistics showing that as companies shed direct employees, they tend to staff up on the contracting workforce too, right? And so that's a more quote unquote flexible workforce for them. It doesn't show in their general headcount. It's not a committed line item in the budget. And so it's less I think scary for them at moments of economic contraction to do that. But how does that contribute to occupational segregation, right? Where you have these sort of, prestige laden jobs that are paid at a very high margin. And then you have people working side by side who are predominantly people of color, women and non-binary, who are making lower wages, fewer benefits, and you're increasing that, right? Versus creating a pipeline and a pathway for those workers to come into your company and receive the same type of benefits. So that's what I would add from our work. Yeah, Ron.
So I just say, it's amazing to me that OFCCP, which is the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, hasn't gone out to Silicon Valley and exercised its authority to do something about the abysmal track record in DEI in Silicon Valley. And you can just contrast it with where I live in the Washington, DC metro area, where there's much better diversity in the tech industry. And there's a big tech industry here. But out in Silicon Valley, there's very little. And OFCCP, again, the DOL has authority and could exercise it if they had the will to.
Yeah, and actually, speaking on your experience, Dr. Hira, we've talked a lot about caste equity and equities in tech, especially given when Thinmori Soundararajan was booted from a Google Talk. And so we have a couple of people in the chat wondering, how does caste inequity within tech play into these layoffs and into the dynamics with immigration workers?
So I'm not familiar with the particular case you're talking about. Is this like cast like from India, from South Asians,
Yeah.
where it transfers over?
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know the details there. I've read about this, the cases with Cisco, I think was one of the companies that was accused of it. I think it's something that needs to be looked into. I don't know what the legal rights are, but certainly the companies could do the right thing if they were, pressured in the correct way. So is there, I don't know if there's a specific question there or.
Well, someone asked how caste equity can become enforced within a corporate infrastructure. They also plugged this critical caste studies syllabus in the chat. So if anyone's interested, they could check that out. But if that's not your area of expertise, we can.
Yeah.
Totally
We
understand.
also, Marion, maybe it's worth mentioning, we could send this as a follow-up. We did an event on sort of caste bias in tech with experts on this in the tech industry that we could share as a follow-up material too for people that are interested, although it sounds like this person might be familiar with that work too.
Yeah, can probably ask them. Sweet. And actually, passing over to you, Melissa, someone had a question about your experience at Twitter, and thank you again for sharing your story. It really helps paint the picture of what's happening to so many workers across the industry. So thank you. When someone asked, when you were laid off, what communication did you receive from your legal employer? So the staffing agency or the vendor that had the contract with Twitter, did they offer any support, or was it also, you were just left in the dark?
No, so there's that week period where this week of uncertainty where JIRA tickets were being filed. I contacted my employer, and I want to explain just very briefly the contracting structure at Twitter. So I was employed by a small company. It's got about 25 employees. Twitter used a lot of contracting agencies, both in the US and around the world. They were mostly managed under the umbrella of one company called Magnet, or Pro. You might see it listed that way. So most of my communications were with Pro, even though I was paid by my actual agency. So it was a kind of this insulated structure. So it was very, very difficult to find out exactly what was going on. So I contacted both companies, Magnet and my contracting company, and I said, hey, listen, what's happening? My primary concern right now is that I get paid. I have to submit a time card every week, and it has to get approved. It hasn't been approved for the last 2 weeks. What's going to happen? My agency said, hey, if you get paid, we get paid. That was literally their response. And I said, well, then it's in both of our interests for me to get paid. And maybe you could do something about this. And I was pretty desperate at that point. And there's just no transparency. So once I was laid off by being booted out of the system, I did finally get an email. As you know, we've been reorganized, blah, 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 your position's been eliminated. That happened after the fact. I've been in tech for a while now, and typically a manager sits you down either in person or over Zoom. Layoffs are something of a feature of the industry, unfortunately, and that's just not how it was handled this time.
I also just want to add, I'm trying to restrain myself from geeking out about this, but another, sort of legal sort of thing to know, and we talk about this a lot in our papers, and folks should check out the Contract Worker Disparity Project if you aren't familiar with contracting, because we kind of break down what it is and why companies do it. But one of the reasons, like Melissa was saying, that she was having this experience is because companies want to avoid liability. They say that Melissa works for a separate employer, even though her working conditions or assignments, whether or not you're laid off, are dictated by the lead company. They don't claim responsibility for what happens to you because you're technically employed by a different employer. And there's a few different rules that govern that, but the Biden administration is looking at actually making those rules more true to life. So we just submitted a comment about joint employer rules at federal agency. And I think that's another place that folks should pay attention to if you're interested in these issues, is joint employer rules, because they are not used always appropriately in tech and lots of other industries.
Absolutely. And actually, speaking about the Biden administration, we have a question for you, Ron, about what's your sense about the prospects of getting immigration reform done during the lame duck period, quote unquote, and whether skilled visas will be any part of that?
Well, I'm probably the worst political prognosticator there is. I think that's true of a lot of political science professors. There are a couple of immigration provisions. One in particular around skilled visas. It's actually about green cards and changing what's called the per country limit. I won't get into the details. It's called the Eagle Act. I don't know where it's going to go. It's sitting in the House. They want to go up for a vote, but even if it gets voted there and it gets passed, it still has to go to the Senate, and the clock is running out pretty quickly. And they have some other must-pass legislation like NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, that they've got to do. So it's always possible, but it looks like time's running out for it.
Got it. Thank you. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we have someone who asked, now I'm a full-time tech worker. I got really nervous in the layoffs, but thankfully my job was safe. What can I do today to strengthen layoff protections for contract workers, for full-time workers? What can I do? So that's for anyone.
I mean, well, I would plug all of our organizations. I mean, really, and it's not just a plug, but truly, right? I mean, the reality is and I hope it's okay to say this, right? But when we have service workers that are being laid off, there's 6 organizations locally that I call to make sure that they know it's happening and to see if we can collaborate. And TechEquity is one of them. And the reason why is because I know we share our values, and I know that they're in relationship with tech workers, that again, it's incredibly important to have tech workers use their power and their voice to support. And so it really is, I don't know what joining actually means, but being like really in relationship with TechEquity so that they can be talking to you all when there are big layoffs happening to service workers. And then the same for us, right? I mean, I think if you send me a note, I can make sure that Silicon Valley Rising, that we have your information so that again, when we have service workers that are in motion, that we can reach out to you. And especially if you are working at a specific company where there is a fight happening, that we can be in relationship with you and talk to you about how you can personally support them.
Yeah, and I will just add, joining for us is as simple as just like getting in our list. We send a weekly newsletter and we send updates like the ones that Maria Noel is mentioning, so tech workers know what's happening around these issues that they care about, as well as we have people on our list that aren't tech workers that are in the community that want to also be helpful, that care about the impact of the tech industry. So we try and make sure that folks are working together. And then we also invite people to, join our events. I want to lift up, one of the things that's powerful is we ask people to call in and give a Me Too when we have legislation to help workers in the tech industry, which sometimes can be arduous, but even just having 2 or 3 tech workers who call and say, I'm a tech worker at a large tech company in California. I support this legislation. I support contractors having equal rights. It goes a long way with legislators. And our senior director of advocacy, Megan Abel, who I know is in the chat right now, she's done a lot of training with our community on sort of how important civic engagement is, and that it's not actually, you don't need to commit 3 hours on a Thursday to a phone bank shift. You can, write a letter, you can sign on to a petition, you can contribute to Silicon Valley Rising to make sure they have funds to bring gig workers to the legislature, right, when they're lobbying. So there's lots of ways to do this. And just want to add that, it may seem like, oh, it's not important for me to make that call, or it's not important for me to sign this thing. It actually goes a huge way because legislators, they hear from CEOs. They don't hear from workers. So every time they hear from workers, it has a huge impact. So just want to add that as well. And I think we're at time. So I just want to thank our panelists again. Really, really appreciate each of you coming and sharing your experiences and the experiences of folks you work with and work on behalf of. And so we just appreciate you sharing your voice and your stories and being a part of our community and helping bring our community into awareness on these issues. And we will be sending follow-up materials and just encourage folks to join our networks and stay involved, stay connected. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.